She lifted her eyes to the young baron as if she had always known him, and that was the first dangerous thing. The second was this: on that blazing estate, where a house slave was shamed every day before sunrise and after dark, the man who should have looked away would one day risk his name, his marriage, and his inheritance for her. Stay with me, because before this woman could ever touch freedom, she would have to survive the kind of cruelty meant to crush the soul in plain daylight. It was the summer of 1847 on a coastal sugar estate in Veracruz, where the heat clung to the skin like wet cloth. The cane fields shimmered white-green under the sun. The walls of the main house burned bright as chalk, and the iron balconies above twisted into leaves and serpents threw long shadows over the courtyard stones. Beyond the kitchens, half hidden behind dusty banana trees, the enslaved families slept in low adobe huts, where the air smelled of smoke, boiled maize, and old sorrow. The young woman was called Amara. She was 20, dark-skinned, fine-boned, and already carrying the quiet weariness of someone who had been ordered about since childhood. She knew how to grind corn before dawn, wash linen until her knuckles split, bring down a fever with mountain herbs, and stitch flowers so delicate they looked ready to breathe. The dowager of the house hated her with a special, patient hatred. Since the day the girl had arrived by cart at 12 years old, that old lady had found new ways to humble her. 20 trips with water from the well to the kitchen, kneeling on raw kernels, even the shame of having her head shaved again and again. That afternoon, after another punishment in the courtyard, Amara did not beg, she did not sob, she only looked up. And Don Sebastián de Vergara, 42, fresh from his dead father's rooms and dressed in mourning black despite the heat, stopped cold when he saw her face. If stories like this stay with you, subscribe and keep listening, because that night, from somewhere beyond the banana trees, he heard her voice in the dark and understood that the lashes had never reached the deepest part of her. By morning, the song had vanished into the heat, and the house had gone back to its old habits. The dowager's habits were the worst of them. Doña Inés de Vergara liked punishment arranged neatly, the way other women liked lace folded in cedar chests. If Amara crossed the kitchen too slowly, she was sent to the well again. If she crossed it too quickly, she was told she had forgotten her place. That day alone, she carried water from the stone well to the rear kitchen 20 times, the rope burning her palms, the bucket rims striking her shins until they bruised a deep plum color. At noon, when one of the copper pots was found dull, the old woman ordered raw corn scattered over the flagstones and made her kneel there while the cook fires smoked and the servants kept their eyes lowered. And when that still did not satisfy her, she called for Genaro Prieto. Everybody on the estate knew the sound of his boots before they saw him. Slow, heavy, certain. He came with the smell of horse sweat, leather, and stale cane liquor. Amara stood straight when he stopped in front of her. That was what angered Doña Inés most. Not beauty, though she had hated that too since the girl first came from the coast in a creaking cart at 12. No, it was the dignity that refused to crawl. Afterward, when dusk lowered over the banana trees and the chapel bell gave one tired note, 2 women from the kitchen found her behind the washyard. Tomasa Beltran brought a cup of water. Serafina Ibarra brought the little clay jar they kept hidden in a flour sack, tallow and aloe beaten together with a spoon until it turned pale green. Their fingers were gentle on her back. "Your grandmother used to sing when the pain was bad," Tomasa whispered. Amara closed her eyes. Her grandmother had died that way, singing in Mandinga, while everyone around her listened without understanding a word. From the upper corridor, where the shutters were half open against the heat, Sebastián heard the low murmur of women's voices, and then one name, spoken so softly it made him step closer. He stayed at the shutter a long time after the voices below had faded. Sebastián had spent years teaching himself not to feel too much inside that house. It was the only way a man could inherit his father's rooms, his father's ledgers, his father's silence, and still sit upright at supper. Don Gregorio de Vergara had left him everything that weighed and almost nothing that warmed. The sugar mill with its groaning wheels, the title, the debts, and the marriage that had gone cold before it had even learned how to be tender. At 42, he knew law from Havana, philosophy from Madrid, and the sound of French sorrow in his own voice. He also knew better than to speak certain names aloud. Rousseau stayed hidden behind a row of sermons in his library, because his father had once warned him, hand already turning blue with death, that ideas could rot a bloodline faster than vice. But that night the old discipline failed him. He could still hear the women in the wash-yard, the scrape of the clay jar, the breath Amara drew when the ointment touched broken skin. Behind all of it, he heard something stranger, the force with which she held herself together. It unsettled him more than any scream would have. The next morning he found a reason to alter the house list. It was a small thing, almost shamefully small. He told the steward, old Mateo Cebrian, that the linen inventory needed sorting indoors, away from the back court where Genaro liked to linger. Mateo, who had served the family for 40 years and missed very little, looked at him over the rim of his spectacles and said only, "As you wish, senor." Those were the first of his small, secret mercies. By late afternoon, Amara was moved from the washstones to the long room beside the chapel, where the air held beeswax, old dust, and the faint bronze smell of the bell brought long ago from Spain. She thought it was chance at first. Then she found, beside the folded linen, a cup of cool water that had not been there a moment before, and footsteps retreating softly beyond the door. She noticed the water at once, and because she was not foolish, she mistrusted it. On an estate like that, kindness almost always came with a trap hidden inside it. A softer chore could turn into a hand on the wrist. A kind word could become a debt by nightfall. Amara had seen it before. Years earlier, a distant cousin of hers, Florinda Mancera, had been whispered about in the huts for months. Favored for a season, watched with envy, then gone in a cart before dawn. Some said she had been sold south to a sugar mill in Tabasco. Some said she was carrying the old baron's child when she vanished. No one said her name loudly after that, so when Amara found a second cup the next day, and then a folded cloth laid where the window breeze could reach her back, she said nothing. She worked with her head down, hands quick over the linen, hearing the murmur of the chapel beyond the wall and the distant crush of cane carts rolling toward the mill. The room smelled of starch, beeswax, and sun-warmed stone. Her skin still stung under her dress. By the third day, she understood these were not accidents. Mateo passed once with a ledger under his arm and did not look at her, yet somehow her work remained indoors, while other girls were sent outside under Genaro's eye. At noon, a plate with 2 slices of guava appeared near the wash basin, too fine a thing for any kitchen mistake. Small, secret mercies. That was what Serafina called such moments, though she crossed herself after saying it, as if mercy inside that house might draw punishment down on everyone. That evening, as the sky turned copper over the cane, Sebastian stood in the doorway of the linen room for the first time. He did not come close. He only rested one hand on the frame and listened while she folded the last sheet. Then very quietly he asked, "Was it your voice I heard the other night?" Amara's fingers stopped on the cloth. From somewhere outside, beyond the banana trees and the servant huts, a woman began one of the forbidden songs at midnight, before midnight had even come. The note hung in the air between them like smoke. Amara did not turn at once. Her hands stayed on the sheet, smoothing the same crease again and again, while the voice outside drifted through the dusk. It was an old melody, low and circular, the kind women used when work was too hard for speaking. At last she said, "You should not ask me that, senor." Sebastian remained in the doorway. The last light from the courtyard touched one side of his face and left the other in shadow. "Then I should not have listened either," he said softly. "But I did." She turned then, slowly, wary as a creature that has learned where traps are hidden.
"Those songs were my grandmother's," she said. "She brought them in her mouth from the coast they took her from. When she was dying, she sang until she had no breath left."
The others in the hut wept because they understood she was leaving, even if they did not know the words. She held his gaze only a moment.
"Songs like that are not for this house."
He took that in as if it hurt him. Perhaps it did. The chapel bell gave a dull bronze moan somewhere beyond the wall, and from the yard came the wet slap of linen against stone. The next day he said nothing to her, nor the day after. Yet the mercies continued. A heavier basket shifted to another servant before it reached her arms. A message sent her through the shaded corridor instead of across the open yard. Once, when Genaro came looking with that slow, ugly patience of his, Mateo told him the master required an account checked at once. The overseer spat into the dust and left. By the end of the week, Amara understood the pattern. Sebastian was shielding her without ever standing close enough to shame her for it. That frightened her more than if he had tried to touch her. Because fear she knew how to fight. Hunger, pain, mockery, even the razor every few months. Those belonged to the world she understood. But when she passed the library that Saturday night, she heard something through the half-closed door that stopped her cold. He was trying, in his rough, careful voice, to hum her grandmother's song. She stood outside the library door without meaning to breathe. The room beyond was lit by 2 oil lamps and the red mouth of a dying fire. She could smell leather bindings, candle smoke, and the faint sharpness of cane liquor from a glass left untouched on the desk. Sebastian was alone. A book lay open beside him, but he was not reading. He was trying to follow the path of the melody he had heard from the servants' quarter, catching one note, losing the next, then beginning again with the patience of a man ashamed to fail. Amara should have gone. Any sensible woman in her place would have slipped away at once. Instead, she listened until the tune broke apart in his throat. Then, before fear could stop her, she spoke from the dark side of the corridor.
"You are carrying the end too high, senor."
He turned so quickly his chair scraped the floor. For one startled moment he looked almost young. Then he gave a short, helpless laugh. So I was. She stepped only as far as the threshold, keeping the shadow around her.
"It is sung lower, here."
And very softly, hardly more than breath, she sang the line the way her grandmother had taught it, with the note bending at the end like a reed in wind. He listened with his whole face. Again she should have left, but he asked what the words meant, and after a pause, she told him. Not all of it, only enough. River, mother, return, sleep. He repeated the sounds carefully, his French soft accent making them strange and tender at once. For the first time, something almost like warmth passed between them without touching either skin. That was the beginning of a new danger. Because the house had ears. A maid carrying lamp oil saw Amara near the library after hours. Mateo noticed the same maid whispering in the pantry before dawn. The next morning, when the household gathered for chocolate, Doña Inés looked across the table at her husband's son, then toward the linen corridor, and smiled with a stillness that made even the spoons go quiet. Before noon, she sent for the razor. The razor lay on a folded towel beside the wash basin, bright as a threat. Amara saw it before anyone spoke. The morning was already hot. Flies worried the edge of a fruit bowl in the kitchen, and the cane carts outside groaned over the ruts in the yard. Tomasa went still with a ladle in her hand. Serafina lowered her eyes. Across the room, Doña Inés sat near the window in a rustling silk wrapper, taking chocolate from a porcelain cup as if this were any ordinary household task.
"It is time again,"
she said. Every few months the same ceremony returned. A chair in the service court, a cloth around the shoulders, the scrape of steel against scalp while the others pretended not to hear. The old woman always chose the busiest hour, when maids crossed with baskets and stable boys passed with harness leather over their arms. Humiliation worked best for her when it had witnesses. Amara sat because refusal would only feed the spectacle. Her fingers tightened once on the chair arms, then became still. The razor was handled by a laundress with trembling hands, not by the mistress herself. First one dark curl fell, then another. Sweat slid down the back of Amara's neck. Somewhere above, shutters opened. She did not look up. Sebastian did. He had come into the corridor too late to stop it, and too bound by years of cowardly habit to stride down and overturn the basin. What he saw instead was worse than anger. The woman in the chair did not plead. She did not bow her head in shame. When the last lock dropped into the dust, she lifted her eyes toward the balcony for one brief second, and his chest tightened so sharply he caught the rail. Doña Inés saw that glance. That was when her own face changed. Until then, she had been entertaining herself. Now she was thinking. Before noon, Amara was sent back to work with her scalp raw under the sun. By evening, Mateo brought Sebastian the household assignments for the next week, and tucked between 2 pages was a single line in the steward's careful hand. The señora has asked twice today where the girl sleeps, and whether Cordoba still pays well for young house slaves. That single line from Mateo robbed Sebastian of sleep. He read it by lamp glow, once, then again, while the house settled around him with its usual night sounds. Crockery being stacked below, a mule stamping in the yard, the sea wind worrying the shutters. On his desk lay a law book from Havana he had not opened in years. Before dawn, he had it spread wide, one hand pressed over his mouth, searching old rules on dowries, household authority, and human property. The words were dry as bone, but one thing came clear enough. His wife could command the rooms, the servants, the table, the tone of the house. Yet ownership of the enslaved people attached to the estate title, and the title was his. That did not calm him. It made the danger sharper. By breakfast, Doña Inés had already begun her little probes. She asked why the linen accounts had become so important. She asked why Mateo was sending one particular girl through indoor corridors. She asked it all with sugar on her tongue and poison underneath. Sebastian gave her nothing. He drank his chocolate, barely tasted it, and said the books of the house required better order. She smiled in a way that made the silver spoon in her fingers look like a weapon. Amara felt the change too, though no one explained it to her. Work shifted around her again, this time with a nervous haste she did not trust. Tommaso warned her not to linger in doorways. Serafina pressed a scrap of cassava bread into her hand and whispered, "Eat when you can." Even Genaro seemed to be waiting for some instruction not yet spoken. The whole estate held that strange stillness that comes before a storm breaks over Cain. Near sunset, Mateo found Sebastian in the passage outside the chapel and spoke without looking directly at him. "If the señora means to sell the girl," he murmured, "she will do it quickly. Before you decide whether you are the master here, or only a guest at your own table." That same evening, while Amara carried folded altar cloths past the main salon, she heard Doña Inés say to a visiting merchant very clearly, "Cordoba pays best for obedient young women, but I have one who still needs breaking." The words she heard in the salon stayed under her skin all evening. Cordoba. The name moved through the servants' huts like a bad wind. No one had to explain what it meant. Harsher cane, rougher hands, men who bought young women as if buying mules with good teeth. Amara kept working until dark, sorting altar cloths by the weak gold light that fell through the chapel window, but inside she was already counting hiding places, paths, faces she could trust. When she returned to the huts behind the banana trees, Tomasa saw her expression and did not waste breath. "You heard something," the older woman said. Amara nodded. Serafina stopped mending a torn sleeve and looked toward the door. "Then sleep dressed," she whispered, "and keep your shoes near your hand." Later, when the moon had climbed over the cane and the estate finally thinned into silence, Amara did not sleep. Neither, as it happened, did Sebastian. He came down from the house by the side corridor instead of the front stair, without lantern, without coat, moving like a man ashamed of being seen by his own walls. He found Matteo in the counting room, still awake over the ledgers. "If she tries to sell the girl," Sebastian said in a low voice, "how quickly can it be done?" Matteo closed the book in front of him. "With cash already promised?" "Before breakfast, if the mistress chooses." Then he added after a pause, "Unless the master chooses first." Those words sent him to the chapel passage. He did not know if she would be there, yet she was, standing in the dark with a folded shawl over one arm as if she had been waiting for trouble itself to arrive. When he stepped from the archway, she flinched, then steadied. "I heard her," Amara said before he could speak. "The lady means to send me away." The chapel smelled of wax and hot stone. Outside, some night bird cried once and fell silent. Sebastian drew a breath. "If your name is spoken again with Córdoba," he said, "you come to me at once. Do you understand?" Amara looked at him for a long moment, and then asked the one question he had not prepared for. "And if it is you who cannot stop her?" Her question stayed between them so long that the chapel candles gave a little hiss in their glass cups. Sebastian did not answer quickly, and she watched him for that. Men with power were always quick when they meant to command. Slow truth was rarer. At last he said, "Then I will have failed you." His voice came out rough, almost angry with himself. "But I have not failed yet." Amara kept the shawl folded against her chest. The night air was warm, carrying the smell of damp earth and cane juice from the mill. "Words will not stop a cart," she said. "No," he replied, "but some marks on paper can." He glanced down the dark passage toward the accounting room, then back at her. "Can you read names, inventory lines, sale records?" She gave the smallest shake of her head. Something changed in his face then. Not pity, resolve. You must learn enough to know when danger has been written before it reaches you. The next afternoon he found a way. Matteo sent her with a bundle of old household lists to the small room where damaged ledgers were kept, a place that smelled of ink, mildew, and dried leather. Sebastian was already there, standing by the window with dust in the light around him. He did not step too close. He only laid one sheet on the table and pointed to a merchant's name. "This is how men hide theft," he said quietly, "and how they hide sales." Amara stared at the black marks as if they were thorns. He showed her the shape of one letter, then another, then the way a name held still on a page even when a liar spoke over it. There was no sweetness in it, no game, only urgency. By the end of that first secret hour, her brow was damp, her fingers stained with charcoal, and she could recognize her own initial when he wrote it large on scrap paper. When she rose to go, he swept the page into the stove at once. Too late. From the corridor came the soft click of a fan closing, and a woman's voice, smooth as polished bone. "How careful you two have suddenly become." The voice at the door belonged, of course, to Doña Inés. She entered with her fan half open, dressed in pale silk that whispered over the floor, and let her gaze travel from Sebastian to the stove, from the stove to Amara's charcoal-stained fingers. The little room smelled of warm dust and burnt paper. For one terrible instant, no one moved. Then Sebastian did the only thing he could do without ruining her on the spot. "I am checking old household marks," he said, his tone flat, almost bored. "The steward sends girls who cannot sort one list from another, and then I am expected to repair the confusion." The old woman's eyes rested on Amara. "How industrious." She stepped closer, close enough to see the dark smear on the girl's thumb. "If she has time for lessons, perhaps she has too little work." Amara lowered her gaze. Sebastian answered before she could. "She has exactly the work I assign." That was dangerous, and all three of them knew it. Yet the dowager did not strike. She smiled. Smiles like that are worse than slaps, because they make room for plans. "As you wish," she said, and tapped the fan once against her wrist. "Only be certain your charity does not make the servants vain." Then she turned and left, carrying her perfume of violets and cold malice back into the corridor. After that, everything changed shape. The lessons did not stop, they scattered. A letter traced in spilled flour on a kitchen board before dawn. A name copied with a wet finger on the side of a copper tray. A shipping mark studied on a bale before it went to the storehouse. Mateo became part of the conspiracy without ever saying so. Tomasa coughed when someone was coming. Serafina kept bits of charcoal tucked in her apron hem. Amara learned with a hunger that startled all of them. Within a month, the whole alphabet had taken root in her. She caught letters the way some people catch melodies, hearing the pattern before it was fully explained. One evening, in the dim ledger room, Sebastián set a broken slate in front of her and said quietly, "Write your name." Her hand trembled. The chalk squeaked. One crooked line, then another. And just as the last letter formed, they heard someone stop outside the door. The footsteps outside the ledger room paused, then moved on. For a moment, neither of them trusted the silence that followed. Sebastián crossed to the door, opened it a finger's width, and saw only the long corridor with its cracked tiles and fading light. Somewhere farther off, a maid was laughing too loudly in the kitchen yard. He closed the door again and turned back. Amara was still staring at the slate. Her name looked strange there, as if it belonged to someone who might one day answer to herself. The letters were large and uneven, one leaning into the next, like tired people. Still, they were hers. Sebastián did not praise her. He seemed to understand that praise might break the spell of the thing. He only said very quietly, "Now you can recognize what is meant to erase you." She touched the first letter with one dark fingertip. That night, back in the hut, she waited until Tomasa's breathing turned heavy and Serafina rolled over in sleep. Then she reached beneath her sleeping mat for the bit of charcoal she had hidden there, and by the weak flame of a tallow stub wrote the name again on the adobe wall beside her blanket. Slow, careful, crooked. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. In the morning, Serafina saw it first. She said nothing. She only pressed her hand once over Amara's wrist, then moved her body a little to hide the writing when another girl stepped inside. Before leaving for the kitchens, Tomasa murmured, "Do not let the mistress see that wall." But the house was narrowing around them now. Sebastián's borrowed moments had become harder to steal. Doña Inés began sending for Amara at odd hours, merely to watch her stand and wait. Genaro prowled nearer the inner rooms. Even the air felt sharper, as if the whole estate had begun listening through the cracks. Just before dusk, as Amara carried folded napkins past the library, a page slipped from beneath the door and came to rest against her bare foot. On it, in Sebastián's hand, were only 3 words, "Do not sing tonight." She did not sing that night. The note burned in her apron pocket until the cloth felt warm against her hip. In the huts, after the evening meal of beans and coarse maize, the women settled one by one onto their mats. Usually, when the workday had been too cruel to carry in silence, some low tune would rise from one corner and another voice would answer. That night, Amara kept her mouth closed. Even Tomasa, who noticed everything, asked no questions. Outside, the cane leaves rubbed together in the dark like dry hands, and farther off, the mill creaked as if it too could not sleep. Near midnight came the reason. Boots crossed the yard below the huts. Not 1 pair, 3, slow, deliberate, stopping where the shadows were thickest. Through a crack in the wall, Amara saw Genaro with a lantern held low, and behind him, one of the stable boys, and behind that, a maid from the main house, who pointed with her chin toward the servant doors. They were listening for song. Serafina's fingers found Amara's wrist in the dark and squeezed once. No one in that room breathed above a whisper. The men moved on at last, but the danger did not. At dawn, while the sky was still gray and damp, Mateo intercepted Amara near the well and handed her a folded scrap wrapped around a crust of bread. He did not pause, did not look at her, only muttered that the mistress had ordered a search of the huts before noon. Hidden writings, trinkets, signs of vanity, anything that could be turned into disobedience. Amara's heart lurched straight to the adobe wall by her mat. Her name. She crossed the yard with the bread clenched in her fist and nearly collided with Sebastian in the side passage. He saw her face and understood at once. No words passed between them there. Words were too dangerous. He only took one step nearer, just enough, and opened his hand. In his palm lay a little shard of broken plaster. Then, from the far end of the corridor, Doña Inés called out in a clear, carrying voice, "Bring the house girl to the library. I wish to see what has made her so thoughtful lately." She hid the scrap of paper in her sleeve and obeyed. The library was cooler than the passage, though only by a little. Thick curtains dulled the afternoon glare, and the room held the close smell of leather, lamp oil, and old paper. Doña Inés stood beside the long table with one hand resting on a prayer book she had no intention of opening. Sebastian was there too, near the window, silent and rigid in a way that made Amara's pulse beat harder. "Come closer," said the old woman. Amara did. She could feel the chalk dust still clinging beneath one fingernail. She tucked her hand into her palm. On the table lay harmless things arranged to look like evidence: a rosary, a folded apron, 2 hair ribbons that were not hers, and a little plaster flake. The mistress lifted the last item between finger and thumb. "This was found in the servants' quarter," she said. "Do walls amuse you now?" Amara understood at once. The search had already reached the huts. Either someone had scraped the adobe near her sleeping mat, or Doña Inés was guessing and fishing like a woman with patience enough to drown others in it. "I do not know, Señora," she answered. The fan snapped shut. "Lies always sound plain from low mouths," the mistress murmured. Then she changed tone entirely and turned to Sebastian with practiced sweetness. "You see, the creature grows sly when given too much shade, too much notice, too many errands inside civilized rooms." He did not look at Amara. "You have no proof of anything." That answer cost him. Doña Inés's eyes brightened. From that day forward, the house narrowed again. Amara was sent to heavier tasks, then called back for no reason, then watched while she worked. Finado began appearing near doors before she reached them. Twice she found her blanket disturbed. Once the charcoal was gone. Yet the lessons, impossible as it seemed, did not die. They changed shape once more. A label on a flour sack, a saint's name on a chapel card, a shipping mark on a crate. One storm-thick evening in September, when rain pressed against the shutters and the rest of the house had gone to supper, Sebastian left a volume open on the library stand, as if daring fate to look down and choose its hour. The trap sprang before either of them could pretend not to see it. Rain drummed on the shutters. The corridors had emptied toward supper. In the library, Sebastian stood by the mantel with a volume left open on purpose, though not for romance and not for play. It was a worn book of verses by Fray Luis de Leon, chosen because a page of poetry looked innocent beside ledgers and law. Amara had come only to leave fresh candles and a folded cloth for the leaking sill. But when he touched the open page and asked, in a whisper, whether she knew even one word on it now, she looked down and slowly, carefully, began to sound out the line. Her voice was unsteady at first, then it steadied. The room seemed to lean in around that small miracle. Rain, fire, paper, breath. A woman who had been counted like furniture was reading aloud in a baron's library. Sebastian did not move. He listened as if each word cost her blood. When she reached the end of the sentence, something passed across her face that he had never seen before. Not joy, exactly, but recognition, as if the locked room inside her had found its own key. Then the door flew open. Doña Inés stood there holding a silver candelabrum high enough to throw hard light over both of them. Behind her loomed Genaro, wet from the rain, and one housemaid with her mouth already eager for gossip. The mistress took in the book, the girl, the master, and smiled with such cold delight that even the candles seemed to shrink.
"So,"
she said softly.
"now the house slave reads verses after dark."
Sebastián stepped forward at once.
"This is nothing." "Oh, it is something,"
she replied.
"It is pride, and pride must sleep where all may see it humbled."
She snapped her fingers without taking her eyes from Amara.
"Put her in the courtyard stocks tonight."
Genaro moved before Sebastián could speak, and when Amara turned once toward him, just once, she saw in his face the thing that frightened her more than the old woman's triumph. He had finally run out of silence. After that, events moved with the ugly speed that only cruelty ever seems to have. Genaro dragged the wooden stocks into the courtyard, while the rain thinned to a greasy drizzle. The stones shone dark beneath the lamps. Housemaids watched from the side arcade, pretending to carry basins or folded cloths, their faces pale with the guilty hunger of people relieved the punishment has chosen someone else. Doña Inés stood beneath the covered gallery, dry and composed, and gave her orders as if arranging flowers for Mass. Amara was forced down before the old timber frame, wrists and neck locked in place. The wood smelled of mildew, old sweat, and rust from iron fittings. She did not struggle. Sebastián, white with anger now, stepped forward once and said her name aloud. Only once. The mistress turned on him so fast her skirts snapped. "You will be silent in my courtyard." "It is my courtyard," he said. That was the first time he had ever answered her in front of servants. The silence that followed felt almost holy. Then Genaro, eager to break it, laughed under his breath and laid the strap once across Amara's back before anyone had commanded it. The sound cut through the rain like torn cloth. Tomasa gasped from somewhere in the shadows. Serafina pressed both hands over her mouth. Sebastián moved so suddenly, 2 footmen seized him by reflex, not loyalty, just fear of scandal. For a heartbeat, the whole house seemed to tip toward chaos. Doña Inés did not shout. She did something colder. She ordered the men to escort her husband's son to his rooms until his reason returns, and she told Genaro the girl would remain in the stocks until dawn. So the night stretched. Later, when the courtyard had emptied and only the lantern by the chapel door still burned, Tomasa and Serafina cumped out with holy basil water in a cup and a few raw coffee beans wrapped in cloth. They pressed what comfort they could into Amara's bound hands. Her skin burned. Her shoulders throbbed. Above her, thunder rolled far out over the coast. Somewhere behind shuttered walls, Sebastián stopped being a man who grieved injustice and became a man who began making plans before morning. Before dawn, the courtyard was still wet, and the wood of the stocks had gone cold against her skin. Amara had stopped shivering only because there was no strength left for it. Her shoulders ached with a deep, feverish pull. Rainwater had dried in stiff lines on her dress. Tomasa and Serafina came once more in the darkest hour, one keeping watch, the other touching holy basil water to her lips with careful fingers. When they left, she bowed her head and began to whisper under her breath. Not a prayer from the chapel. The words were old, carried in memory from her grandmother's mouth. River words, crossing words, the kind that belonged to people who had lost land, names, children, and still found a way to call the dead close. Low and steady, she spoke them into the damp air until even the pain seemed to listen. Upstairs, in a room where 2 footmen had been told to keep discreet watch, Sebastián sat fully dressed in yesterday's clothes and did not touch the bed. He had spent the night with candles burning down around him, papers open, his father's old seals scattered across the desk, and one thought heartening inside him with every hour. If law had ever meant anything, It had to mean something now. Mateo came once before dawn, pretending to adjust the shutters. "The mistress sleeps," the old steward murmured. "If you are going, go before the kitchen fire is lit." He left by the side stable while the horizon was still the color of pewter. No servant announced him. No groom asked questions. He saddled his own horse with hands that shook only once, then rode hard for Jalapa, taking the river road where the mist sits low among reeds and white cranes. 3 hours if the mount held. Amara did not know any of that. She only heard, near first light, the sudden hollow quiet that comes when one presence has vanished from a house. Then Genaro stepped into the yard, stretched like a man beginning an ordinary day, and grinned at her through the bars. "Smile while you can," he said. "By tomorrow, you may be on the road to Córdoba." Far ahead on the road inland, Sebastián was already riding toward the one man who might help him put freedom into ink. By the time the sun had burned the mist off the river road, Sebastián's horse was lathered white at the neck. He did not slow until the tiled roofs of Jalapa rose through the trees, and the air changed from salt-heavy heat to the cooler breath of the uplands. He rode straight to the house of Licenciado Tadeo Quiros Aranda, an old companion from his Havana days, a lawyer with a careful beard, discreet enemies, and the reputation of believing that chains did not become holy merely because custom had worn them smooth. Tadeo received him in shirt sleeves, with ink on one finger and surprise in both eyes. "You look as if the dead are behind you," he said. "In the way they are," Sebastián answered. He told him everything in a rush that did not sound like him at all. The punishments, the reading, the stocks, the talk of Córdoba, his own years of cowardice. Tadeo listened without interrupting, save once to pour water, once to shut the shutters against a passing vendor's cry. At the end, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. "What you should have done sooner," he said, "you may still do now, if you stop asking permission from people who profit by saying no." Sebastián stared at him. The lawyer crossed to a cabinet and drew out a blank form, thick paper with room for seals and witnesses. "The enslaved persons attached to the estate stand under your title, not your wife's temper. If you mean to save this woman from sale, there is one clean stroke left. A manumission deed. Properly signed, properly witnessed, registered before noon, if the clerk is sober." The words hit like cold water. "A deed of freedom, in her name," Sebastián said, almost to himself. "Yes," Tadeo replied. "And after you sign it, every hour matters." They went at once to wake a notary who complained before he saw the seal ring. Fees were counted in silver. Ink was mixed fresh. The clerk trimmed a penknife against the nib, while Sebastián stood over the table, rain-dried mud still on his boots. Then the notary asked, "State the name of the woman to be freed." Far away, back at the estate, Genaro was already telling the yard hands to ready a cart. The answer came out of him without hesitation. "Amara Bensu," Sebastián said. The notary repeated it, slower, while the clerk scratched the name into the record. Son of nobody they cared to name? Daughter of a woman long dead? Born under the estate inventory? The old language of ownership tried one last time to swallow her whole, and Tadeo cut through it with a tap of his finger. "Write her as a person," he said sharply, "not as a sack of sugar." The clerk blinked, muttered, and obeyed. Then came the silver fee, counted coin by coin on green felt. Then the seal, pressed hard into wax. Then the final line placed before Sebastián's hand. He signed with a steadier stroke than he had expected, though inside him everything was shaking. When it was done, Tadeo lifted the page, blew gently across the ink, and folded it with great care. "There," he said, "a deed of freedom in her name. From this hour, if anyone tries to sell her, they will be selling what the law no longer recognizes as theirs." Sebastián took the paper as if it were warm. He barely remembered leaving the office. He only remembered the sound of his boots on the steps, the taste of metal in his mouth, and the need to get back before the house moved faster than the law. By then the sun stood high and cruel again over the road to the coast. Back at the estate, the house had indeed moved faster. Doña Inés had ordered Amara washed, combed, and dressed in one of the plain, better frocks used when buyers were to see a servant at a distance. Tomasa's hands trembled so badly while tying the sash that she had to do it twice. Serafina slipped a little packet of dried mint into the girl's palm and whispered, "If they put you in a cart, jump before the second bridge." Amara said nothing. Her face had gone very still. Then, as Genaro came striding toward the service yard with rope and orders, someone else was already cutting through the back passage with a kitchen knife hidden in her sleeve, and the old woman everyone thought too bent with age to matter had finally made up her mind. The bent old woman was called Petra in the kitchen, though most of the younger servants had forgotten she had once carried the master's son on her hip. She came into the service room muttering about needles and torn hems, too ordinary to notice, too old to fear. Genaro had gone to fetch the cart from the lower shed. Tomasa stood at the wash table with red eyes. Serafina kept folding and unfolding the same cloth. Amara sat on a stool while the maid pinned the plain dress at the shoulder, as if she were being prepared for church instead of sale. Petra shuffled behind her, laid one dry hand on the girl's neck as though straightening the collar, and whispered without moving her lips, "When I cut the sash, run toward the back plantain path, not the road." Amara went still all over. The maid stepped away to fetch shoes. In that half-second, Petra's hidden knife flashed once beneath the cloth, not at skin, at the ties, at the loop meant to bind the wrists for transport. The cut was so neat, the rope seemed to loosen by its own will. "Do not thank me," Petra breathed. "Your mother once brought me fever bark when I could not stand." Then Genaro's boots sounded in the passage. The old woman straightened, bent again, and became harmless before he entered. He smelled of wet leather and impatience. "Up," he said. "Buyer or no buyer, the mistress wants her ready." Amara rose. The cut rope hung under the fold of her skirt, invisible if no one looked too closely. Genaro gripped her arm and turned her toward the yard. Outside, the cart wheels already waited in the mud, one mule stamping flies from its belly. On the gallery above, Doña Inés watched with a lace handkerchief in one hand and satisfaction in the other. Then the kitchen boy dropped a tray. Plates shattered. Everyone turned. For one blessed heartbeat, all eyes left her. Amara ran. She flew through the back court, past the herb jars, past the banana trees, into the green heat beyond the huts. Voices broke after her at once. Genaro cursed. Dogs began barking from the lower kennels. Far down the coast road, Sebastián was still racing home with the folded paper inside his coat. She ran without knowing how long her feet could hold. The plantain path was slick from last night's rain, then sandy, then root-knotted where the ground rose and fell beneath scrub and low palms. Branches whipped her face. Her half-fastened shoes came loose almost at once, so she kicked them off and kept going barefoot, her breath tearing at her throat. Behind her, voices spread through the estate lands in ugly bursts. Men calling, dogs answering. Once she heard Genaro's whistle, sharp and hateful, and pushed herself harder. Amara knew the coast better than the people who claimed to own it. As a child, she had been sent with baskets to herb patches near the marsh edges, and older women had taught her which paths held water, which held snakes, which swallowed sound. So she did not run for the main road. She angled toward the places where salt air met fresh reeds, where a scent could break apart, and dogs would have to think instead of follow. By then, the cut on her heel had begun. A shell edge or thorn or sharp stone. She never knew which. She only felt the wet heat of blood and kept moving. Back at the estate, Doña Inés received the news of the escape with a stillness more frightening than anger. She did not strike Petra because she had not yet guessed. She blamed carelessness, then corrected it with cruelty. Dogs were loosed. 2 mounted men were sent east, 1 west. Genaro took the shoreline trail himself, grinning as if he had been promised a sport. At nearly the same hour, Sebastián came through the main gate at a gallop. He saw the cart. He saw the open yard. He saw, at once, that the wrong disaster had already happened. It was Mateo who met him first, breathless, face gray. "Not sold," the steward said. "Gone. She fled before they could tie her." For one heartbeat, Sebastián shut his eyes in pure relief. Then Mateo added, "The dogs are after her." The folded paper was already in Sebastián's hand by the time he turned for the stables again. He took a revolver from the saddle chest, jammed it into his belt, and rode toward the tidal marsh, where she would go if she still trusted the land more than men. The marsh saved her first by confusing sound. Out there, the world changed its rules. The ground gave way in patches under reeds. Salt pools flashed between banks of grass. Crab holes, low mangrove roots, black, slick mud. None of it welcomed running men. Amara staggered through it with blood drying on one heel and cane leaves stuck to her wet dress, following half memory and stubbornness. Twice she slipped to one knee. Once she hid flat behind a hump of oyster shell, while voices passed so close she could smell tobacco and dog breath. Genaro cursed the land, as if the land had insulted him personally. His dogs lost the line at brackish water, found it again where she climbed a sandy rise, then lost it once more at a narrow stream mouth where tide and river met. That bought her minutes, not safety. She knew it. So when she found the broken salt shed near the reeds, roof half fallen and one wall leaning, she crawled inside and forced herself to breathe through the pain. It was there Sebastián found the first sign. A shred of plain dress on a thorn branch. Then a smear of blood on pale sand. Then the print of a bare foot, light but dragging slightly on one side. He dismounted without thinking, left the horse's reins loose, and followed the track with the folded document inside his coat growing damp from sweat. The revolver at his belt felt heavier than iron. Inside the shed, Amara heard him before she saw him. Another man. Another hunter. She snatched up a piece of broken bottle glass and pressed herself against the slanting wall, breath rattling in her chest. When his shadow crossed the doorway, she raised the glass with a hand that shook from exhaustion, but not from fear. "Do not touch me," she said. "I would rather bleed here than go back." Sebastián stopped at once. He took the revolver from his belt and set it down in the sand where she could see it. Then, very slowly, he reached inside his coat and drew out the folded paper. "I did not come to take you back," he said. He knelt in the reeds outside the doorway and opened the sheet with both hands. "I came to put this in yours." For a few seconds, she did not believe him. Why would she? Men with rings and land had promised softer things before. A safer room, a lighter task, a little protection. Those promises usually ended with a locked door. So Amara kept the jagged bottle glass in her hand and looked from the paper to his face and back again, breathing hard, her bare foot leaving a dark spot of blood in the sand. Sebastián did not move closer. "That is the deed," he said quietly. "Signed, sealed, witnessed. I went to Jalapa for it. Tadeo Quiros himself put it through the notary." She swallowed. "Read it." "You read it," he answered. The words seemed to strike her harder than the paper itself. Very slowly, she crouched, still keeping distance, and took the folded sheet from his outstretched hand. The page was thick, official, faintly damp from his coat, wax seal, signatures, her own name, written larger than any inventory line had ever dared to write it. She traced the letters once with a shaking fingertip. Then she began, stumbling over the legal phrases, catching the names, then the core of it. Free woman, effective from this date. No authority to sell, protected under law. By the time she reached the end, the bottle glass had slipped from her hand into the sand. Her mouth trembled before any tears came. "Is it true?" "Yes." "And if they say otherwise?" I stand in court, with witnesses, with the registry, with everything I should have used years ago." The reeds hissed in the wind. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked, and barked again, then lost interest. Amara folded the paper against her chest. For the first time since he had found her, she lifted her eyes fully to him. They were raw with exhaustion, but clear.
"What do you want from me now?"
she asked. The question seemed to pain him. He took a breath and answered like a man walking over broken glass inside himself. Not a servant, not a hidden woman, not gratitude. His voice dropped lower. "If ever there is anything between us, it must begin after this, when you are safe and free and able to refuse me." And at that, from beyond the reeds came the sound of hooves where no friendly rider should have been. The rider was Genaro, and he came in cursing, one hand on the reins and one already reaching for the gun at his belt. He never got to draw it. Sebastian rose from the reeds and fired once into the wet sand at the horse's feet. The animal reared, screaming. Genaro pitched sideways, hit the marsh edge, and lost both pistol and dignity in black mud. By the time he found breath to shout, Sebastian was standing over him with the revolver steady and the folded paper already back in Amara's hands. "Touch her now," he said, "and you answer for assault on a free woman." Those words did what fear had not. Genaro stared first at the seal, then at Sebastian's face, and understood that the old order had cracked in a place it could not mend with a whip. Before noon they were on the road to Jalapa. Amara did not go as his hidden possession. She went under legal protection, lodged first in the house of Tadeo Quiros and his widowed sister, where she learned paid needlework, accounts, and the use of her own name in business. Sebastian lost land, standing, and the last piece of his marriage in the years that followed. Doña Inés fought like a cornered flame and burned out the same way. The coastal estate was sold at last. The title remained, thin as an old ribbon. The chains did not. When he asked for her, he asked openly. When she answered as a woman with her own earnings, her own room key, and her own terms. First, work. Then, time. Then, only if the world could bear to witness it, marriage. He agreed to every word. So they built their life in the high coffee country, where mist climbed the rows at dawn, and children of laborers learned letters at tables she paid for herself. Years later, people said the school bell there sounded different from the chapel bell on the old coast. Lighter, almost surprised. And perhaps that was the truest ending. A hand once forced to carry buckets and kneel on grain came to rest each morning on a slate, writing wages, names, futures. If this story stayed with you, leave a word for Amara below, and stay close for the next long tale.